Mahashi's Global Family Chat. News of rising invincibility around the world. This is the news everyone needs to understand how the trends of time are changing towards peace and prosperity. Mahashi's Vedic technologies, transcendental meditation, and its advanced program Yogic Flying are being implemented globally. Just the square root of 1% of the population practicing yogic flying together in a group is enough to raise the levels of harmony and coherence in the collective consciousness for the whole population. Enjoy the news of enlightenment dawning for every individual, invincibility for every nation, and peace for our dear world. Jai Gurudev, welcome to Mahashi's Global Family Chat on the 15th of November 2016. Dr. Robert Keith Wallace was the first scientist who Mahashi appreciated so much for doing the first scientific research on the transcendental meditation technique, and who Mahashi called the first scientist of the Age of Enlightenment. And Dr. Wallace continues to lead the way in scientific research and point the direction of new research, which he has done in a presentation just recently. And this presentation covers the world of our gut microbes and the variety of the microbes and the incredibly intimate roles that they play in our health and in guiding the unfoldment of our potential, health, and in every area, mental. And this presentation will be fascinating and a joy and education and inspiration to us all to take care of our health through diet mainly, but also through every other way that Mahashi has given us, transcending deeply and comfortably daily, and taking exercise, and having good diet, and doing everything that the ancient texts of Mahashi Ayurveda have prescribed for good health. So here we have Dr. Robert Keith Wallace on the gut microbiome.
Well, as we all know, it's one of those things that Maharishi always encouraged, was to have scientific research on the Vedic studies. And Ayurveda is one area where we really need a great deal of scientific research just to make it something which is really more understandable to people all over the world, particularly in the United States. And there's been a huge development in the field of modern medicine, which really creates a wonderful bridge between the ancient knowledge and modern knowledge. And this is the study of the gut bacteria within all of us. This is a kind of a funny title here, which was, if we see the first slide, which was a lecture I recently gave at MUM. You are not an individual, you are a republic, microbiome, understanding the 30 trillion citizens living inside of you, how our gut bacteria can influence our health. We are familiar with this question. It's a question we're all very eager to answer. Who are we? And now we understand that we're quite a bit different than we previously thought of ourselves. We have a huge number of friendly bacteria which actually are very actively engaged in our health. And it's something which is perhaps most critical in terms of our digestion and in terms of the food we eat. Recent research has shown that we have as many good bacteria as we have cells in our body. You are not what you think you are. And we've always had this aversion to bacteria, this fear of bacteria. And yet it turns out that a very small percentage of the bacteria in our body are harmful. Most of this bacteria in our body and other microorganisms are very important for our health. A microorganism is something which we can define as something which is bacteria. It can be a virus, it can be a fungi, it can even be a microscopic plant or animal. And microscopic organisms represent about half of all life on Earth, and they take many, many different forms. If you just look in your hand, you'll find there are more microorganisms than there are people on the planet. And these microorganisms, as far as we know from modern science, are the oldest residents on Earth 3.5 billion years ago. There are a couple of terms we need to define here just to be able to talk about all this new knowledge. One of them is a word called microbiota, which refers to all the microorganisms living within us. And then we can go to, we can find these in many places. The most abundant place where these microorganisms are in our gut. And as you can, almost a separate organ in the body. It's so important. And we didn't know about all these microorganisms because we couldn't actually measure them. Usually we do cell cultures of bacteria, but these are anaerobic. They live without oxygen, so they're very hard to culture. And we've only been recently able to identify them through gene sequencing. So the whole genetic revolution has resulted in equipment which allows us now to study these bacteria, and it's amazing what we're finding. So the number can range anywhere from 30 trillion to 100 trillion, and the number that are considered healthy or which can cause disease can range from 1% to 5%. Still, these are huge numbers. Another term which we have to get familiar with is this word microbiome. You've probably heard the word genome, which refers to all the genetic information inside your body. Well, the microbiome refers to all the genetic material in the microorganisms in your body or your microbiota. Now, this genetic material, again, is mostly in the gut. It's mostly concentrated in those bacteria in the gut. And if we look at the next slide, we can see that this genetic material is a very large number. There are some 8 million genes in the bacteria in our gut, whereas we only have 22,000 genes. So this is a huge number of genes. Now, that genetic information gets exchanged between all the bacteria. Big question of research today is, does any of that genetic information get into our body? And there's a great deal of controversy about that. So where are all these microorganisms located? Well, particularly in the nasal cavity, oral cavity, skin, gastrointestinal, and urogenital. In our oral cavity alone, we're familiar with, if we don't brush our teeth or mouth our wash out, there are many different microorganisms there. If we leave them, they can cause cavities. But this is just an incredibly small sample of all the microorganisms in our body. As I said before, by far the hugest percentage is in the gut. And this slide doesn't even do justice to it because the density is phenomenal, how many bacteria are in the gut itself. We look at the next slide, we get some idea of these numbers. First of all, in the digestive tract itself, in the stomach and small intestine, there are relatively few species of bacteria generally present. In the colon, in contrast, there are huge number of densely populated microbial ecosystem up to 10 to the 12 cells per gram of intestinal content. Again, this is just massive numbers. Now, the bacteria we have are not only within us, but they actually surround us like a cloud. If you happen to go on to a New York subway, or probably any transit system in the world, you find that that transit system is filled with bacteria, a very large percentage, maybe half. Nobody even knows what they are. But you can find a lot of human bacteria in the subway, about 1.6 coming from the eyes, maybe 10% associated with breathing, 6.5 from the mouth, 32% from the gastrointestinal, 20% from urogenital, and 29% from skin bacteria. So we really, everywhere we go, are bacteria. They surround us. They're on all the areas that we come in contact with. It's just a different world if we could see it in terms of being able to visualize all these bacteria. And then the huge number of bacteria that live within us in these what we call anaerobic conditions without oxygen. So what are the different types of bacteria? Well, again, this is a big surprise to us. There are as many so far, and there could be many more than this, 1,500 different species of all different types. And again, we don't really know the full extent of this. We're just getting an idea right now with all the modern equipment and studies on these different species. We can get a sampling of the major types. These are just the phylum of bacteria, so there are many species within this. So Firmicutes is one of the biggest ones, and approximately 60% of our gut bacteria are this particular type. About 20 to 25% are these bacteroides. And then there's just many, many other types in smaller percentages. Again, if we can look at this in a little different way. So we can look at particular types of bacteria, and we're familiar that there's some good, a lot of good, and a few bad who can be very devastating if they take over. And the good bacteria we're familiar with, varying from Ester coli to lactobacilli, many, many different ones that are good, that help in many functions of the body. The bad ones can be very bad. This Clostridium difficile in the lower right here is an extremely harmful bacteria, which can be caused by a very big dose of antibiotics, and suddenly it takes the upper hand and as we'll see later on, causes very severe problems in the body, even leading to death. So the bacteria really line the lower intestine. That's where they primarily are. And they protect the walls of the lower intestine, believe it or not, from harmful bacteria. The friendly bacteria disallow the harmful ones from getting into our system. This wall is a very delicate area. It has many different functions, but it turns out that the actual role of this large amount of bacteria can contribute to the health of many different organs. The liver can have a huge effect on the immune system, synthesize certain vitamins, synthesize enzymes, regulate appetite, regulate blood sugar, regulate hormone metabolism, synthesize neurotransmitters, increase mineral bioavailability, and again, as I said, this controlling of pathogens, and then to a larger extent, influencing the levels of inflammation in the gut itself and other parts of the body also. So let's go on to the next slide here. These functions are very widespread. As far as the immune system goes, this may be one of the most important ones. It turns out this wall, which separates the gut from our body, is a very, very important lining, this intestinal lining. And you've probably heard about leaky gut syndrome, or it's more technically called intestinal permeability. But if there are breaks in this wall, then bacteria can come in to the body. And there are a very extensive immune system which lines the wall of the intestines, as well as a very extensive nervous system there. And so this is obviously of great importance. And if the bacteria in the gut are disrupted, then certain viruses or certain bacteria can break through the wall and create havoc in the body itself. What are the factors that actually affect the gut bacteria or microbiome? There are many, many different factors. Of course, antibiotics is one of the biggest. It has a huge effect. It's like sending an atomic bomb off in our gut, killing bad bacteria, but also killing many friendly bacteria. So it can have, over a long period of time, can have a very devastating effect on the composition of the gut bacteria. A lifestyle has a big effect, whether you exercise or not. That can influence the types of cells within the gut itself. So certain athletes will have one particular predominance of one type of bacteria, and others will have another, and those that don't exercise at all will have another. The single most important factor is diet. And this is really interesting because it validates everything we know from Ayurveda and other systems of traditional medicine. Food is medicine. Food affects the microbiome. The microbiome affects our immune system, our nervous system, from inflammation to obesity. All kinds of things are affected. And of course, hygiene is something that's quite important. But we may live in a world that's a little too sterile. We may have killed so many bacteria that our immune system doesn't get properly educated as to what is good and what is bad. One of the biggest factors that affects the microbiome is how we're delivered. If it's normally through the birth canal, through vaginal delivery, we get introduced along this canal to a whole host of bacteria, and that bacteria then colonizes our gut. We're presumed to be sterile before we actually go through the birth canal. But once we go through that, then just the right quantity of bacteria into the system and begin to educate the immune system. Now, if we're born through a cesarean delivery, we get really introduced to an entirely different type of bacteria. First of all, the bacteria that's present in a hospital, which we know isn't very good. And second of all, to skin, to anything that happens to be in that environment. And this inevitably leads to an abnormal development of the gut bacteria. And now studies show that children with cesarean birth have a much higher risk for what they call atopic diseases, such as asthma, allergies, celiac disease. They have all kinds of other problems that weren't there before. Now, you wouldn't think this would be a problem. You'd think, oh, there's probably not that many cesarean births, but it's quite the opposite. In this day and age, there are certain countries that have a huge number, up to 80 to 90% in countries like China and Brazil. Even Italy has a high number. Maybe this is for the doctor's convenience. It's not absolutely clear, but the whole thing is switched. Even in the United States, about 1/3 of the births are cesarean. So we are really disrupting right away microbiome in these children that are being born. And then if we give them antibiotics when they're young, we don't breastfeed them, all these things contribute to an abnormal microbiome. Once a child is born, they get exposed to bacteria in many different ways. Oral skin bacteria are transferred from the mother to the infant through suckling, kissing, and caressing. And of course, if we look at the next slide, one of the most obvious ways children get exposed to bacteria is just through play. Children seem to have an affinity to dirt, and this dirt contains a lot of bacteria. And this seems to be a normal process in the colonization of our gut bacteria. One of the biggest factors influencing the colonization or the composition of gut bacteria is age. And if we look at the next slide, we can see a representation of that. In this slide, you can see when the child in the far left, unborn, we don't really see any bacteria. Then as a baby, we see if they're breastfed, they have these like circles with different colors. And these colors represent whether it's a particular type of bacteria, like Firmicutes. You can see on the right the different ones, bacterioids, and so forth. If you're formula fed, you'll have a different composition. Once the child has solid food, then the composition changes once again. Again, illustrating that diet is all important in the composition of the microbiome. If a child has antibiotic treatment, that changes it. They're healthy, they have one type. If they're malnutritioned, another type. And as an adult, it changes. So as you grow older, the diversity grows more. A healthy person shows one type of composition, and a obese person shows a different type. And then as we get much older, again, the whole thing changes again. We begin to lose some of the diversity. So age is quite important, and it's one of many different factors. As I said before, food is one of the most important factors. And there have been a number of studies where they've compared the microbiome both from a perspective of geography and diet. And they can look at children in Italy and compare them with children in Africa and Burkina Faso. And there they find that it's quite a big difference in the composition of the bacteria, and probably mostly due to the actual fibrous content of the food itself. But they've also done studies in the West where they've taken people on an extremely high protein meat diet, bacon and hamburgers and all sorts of just, pure meat diet. And they have one type of bacteria, bacterioids, much higher. And those that consume carbohydrates have a different type, these Prevotella type. So diet is extremely important. Now, we've all heard about probiotics. And probiotics really are just foods that contain bacteria. They can be digested. It's not always clear that they get to the lower intestine. Some people encapsulate them in certain types of pills that are, coverings that, in an attempt to see that they'll get to the lower intestine. But the studies are very unclear on this. Prebiotics are another way of enriching the bacteria, and they're usually foods that are really not digestible. And so these foods go to the lower intestine, and there they are really used by the bacteria, and they serve as a way of allowing the bacteria to multiply. A lot of different studies on probiotics and prebiotics, a lot of controversy. Perhaps the biggest controversy is in Europe. The laws regulating probiotics are much stricter in Europe than they are in the United States. In fact, even the use of the word probiotics is virtually prohibited. So, big area of controversy. And yet, probably one of the most important potential medicines that we have in the world. The biggest question is, do these probiotics actually get to the lower intestine? And if they get there, do they have any effect? It's a bit, let's say you have 1 million bacteria, but they're entering an environment with 30 trillion with very well staked out territories along the lining of the gut, and a very severe populations that are quite strong. So the chances of the probiotics getting through are not as good as it would seem to be, and therefore they would have to be given at regular intervals, and we'll see there may be different ways of administering them. So the gut bacteria have been associated with a huge number of diseases. This is just a few of them here. HIV, diabetes, cancer, liver disease, rheumatic disease, inflammatory bowel disease, chronic heart disease, kidney disease, insomnia, obesity, and autism, and also Alzheimer's, irritable bowel syndrome, all types of diarrhea. I mean, the list goes on and on. Autoimmune diseases like multiple sclerosis. It's huge. And that's why probiotics are potentially a very interesting area. The problem is that the studies haven't been that clear, and they're very demanding for to be able to make the claims that many of these commercial enterprises do. So let's look at one particular area which you never expect, and that is, how do the gut bacteria influence mental health, particularly stress, depression, and anxiety? It turns out the gut bacteria have a huge influence on the brain. Nobody even imagined it. And so these gut bacteria have many different ways of communicating with the brain. And even though the brain is very protected in its normal way, the gut bacteria have quite interesting channels to get into the brain and actually affect our mental state. And we know from many different studies that the brain can affect the gut itself. So stress, obviously, will cause all kinds of effects through the nervous system, usually resulting in a state where there's a disruption of the gut bacteria, dysbiosis. And stress can cause inflammation. It can cause all kinds of different problems. But now what we find is that the gut itself can influence the brain. So we're realizing that this is a whole bidirectional communication that goes on. It's a complicated system because there are many factors involved, and we have to use kind of animal models to study it. But in some of these animal models, the results are extremely clear. You can bring up mice that are basically germ-free, and they have a very bad stress response. They get a huge cortisol spikes, and they don't respond in the normal way with their anxiety measures. So if you introduce one single bacteria, you can reverse that whole situation. Just one single bacteria can suddenly normalize their stress response and change how they respond in terms of anxiety. So this is kind of an amazing and huge thing. And there are many, many different studies in this area which are indicating that you get remarkable changes in the mental health just through the introduction of specific bacteria. This is one particular model where they take a mouse, they inject it with a mock virus. It induces an immune spike. They get these animals autistic-like behavior, which is also accompanied by basically this sort of leaky gut syndrome where you have all kinds of inflammation and problems in the gut. And that is something which you also see in children with autism. They have typically often very serious chronic gut problems. Now, with these mice, where it's a kind of a model they used, again, if you introduced one bacteria, you balance out the whole gut. Suddenly you seal this leaky gut syndrome or increased permeability. And the animals also stop having this autistic-like behavior. So once again, another model which is indicating that just manipulating the gut bacteria can have a dramatic effect on the mental health of the animal. Now, of course, you can imagine that this is going to cause people to want to study humans, and already there are, a whole line of people that are embarking on this. Next study, again with mice again, but showing that certain diets, a maternal regular diet, which is high fat, it can alter the gut bacteria. You can see oxytocin levels, all kinds of a hormone associated with social behavior. And if you look at the offspring in these animals, they have this dysbiosis, this problems in the gut bacteria, and then suddenly you introduce the right bacteria and the whole thing normalizes. So it's just another study showing the same idea, but with many different types of measurements. So what are the channels of communication? Well, this is an enormous area. The vagus nerve is one. There are what are called short-chain fatty acids. Butyric acid is another. Spinal pathways. There's a whole nervous system in our gut, 500 million neurons. We make more serotonin in our gut than we do in our brain. We have virtually almost all the neurotransmitters in our gut. So there's a nervous system, an immune system, and all these bacteria, which are all interacting along this gut lining. And the bacteria themselves are producing neurotransmitters, which are then getting across the gut and influencing the whole body. So many different channels of communication. And you could say that, people in the olden days, when they said, well, I don't feel good in the head, people would immediately say, oh, something's wrong with your digestion. We live in a society where, oh, no, take a pill to change your brain. But Ayurveda and all these traditional systems understand that the gut is the critical area. And this is what we're now understanding, that these microbiotic changes, whether it's due to stress or environment or diet, it can lead to this breakdown in the epithelial cells, leaky gut, cause all kinds of immune problems and inflammation. This can actually affect the blood-brain barrier. You can affect these things, get into the blood system, affect the blood-brain barrier. You get alterations in neurotransmitter levels, changes in synaptic plasticity, and you can change behavior and mood. So it's much, much more complicated than we imagine, and the gut plays a major role. Even Alzheimer's disease, you get these odd beta amyloid plaques, which nobody knew what they were. Now we understand they're sort of immune debris. Perhaps some bacteria, virus has gotten into the brain by the blood-brain barrier being affected somehow by the gut bacteria. These bacteria get in, the immune system responds to it, and you get this buildup of debris, which is often associated with Alzheimer's disease. I'd say the biggest area of interest these days is obesity. The gut bacteria will dramatically affect the obesity of animals, and that we haven't done the studies in humans; they haven't been done yet, but there's a huge interest in it. If you take the animals, you take these germ-free animals, and you put in normal gut bacteria, you get one expression. If you put gut bacteria from an obese animal, the animal turns obese in these germ-free animals. And if you put it from a lean animal, then the animal gets lean. So the type of transfer of the gut bacteria in these germ-free animals directly affects its weight. And perhaps the most bizarre and interesting and wild thing is this notion of, here if you take human adults, these are twin female adults, you take some of the gut bacteria from the stool, you put it into a mouse, and that if in this case they had genetically identical twins, one was obese, one was lean. The obese one, if you took the stool and put it into the intestines of the mouse, it became fat if the human was fat, and it became lean if the human was lean. So, I mean, it's incredibly suggestive that the gut bacteria have an enormous role in whether we're obese or whether we're lean. And you can imagine what this is doing on the market. This whole area of transplanting the gut bacteria, perhaps the widest use of this knowledge right now is for one single condition called Clostridium difficile. And this is a particular condition which is often caused by antibiotics. So excessive use of antibiotics can cause this very, very severe infection in the lower intestine. And it's, huge abundance of this one type of bacteria. Now, people said, well, how can you correct it? And the way they generally deal with it is antibiotics. But there is another way of doing it. And that is, if you actually take stool or feces from a healthy person, transplant it through an enema into one person infected, that person in 90% of the cases becomes well again. So this is commonly used in hospitals right now. Now, what they're trying to do is analyze the stool sample of the healthy person and figure out which are the most important bacteria. And then more than likely, these bacteria will be something that will then be either through an enema or through orally, if they can have the right delivery system, put into the person to correct the infection. But whatever way it is, it's kind of letting us know that the world is changing. The recognition of the importance of having a healthy gut is really, really mainstream right now. It's huge, the amount of research coming out. And ultimately, it does a huge amount to verify Ayurveda. First of all, food is medicine is critical in Ayurveda. We have yet to discover how all these different spices and all the different herbs, or in fact, how meditation, transcendental meditation affects the gut bacteria. But my guess will find that it has a very positive effect. But what happens if it got completely disrupted through antibiotics over long periods or, many other different factors? Well, we know in Panchakarma, one of the things that's used is a basti, an enema. And these enemas basically can often, the nutritive bastis, are actually filled with either yogurt or milk or various spices and oils, which can have a very positive effect on the healthy bacteria and a very negative effect on the unhealthy bacteria. This would really help us to understand how this particular aspect of Ayurveda, the nutritive bastis, was maybe the whole direction of modern medicine is going that way, looking at how you can correct the state of the gut bacteria and create a healthy gut bacteria. So the final message is just that this understanding of bacteria is turning out to be fabulous for us. It's a recognition that we are one with the world, that these bacteria really help us, and they protect us from the unfriendly ones. That many of them contains viruses. These viruses are important. It's like a whole part of the universe we're trying to sterilize ourselves against, turns out to be critical to our health. And as we begin to understand, we really do have a symbiotic relationship with all aspects of nature, and we begin to understand how Ayurveda understood that many thousands of years ago, we gain an appreciation of a brand new direction of modern medicine, which is now looking at the gut, the digestive system, the whole way. We know Vata, for example, Vata is located in the lower intestines. Well, Vata is, a critical part of 80% of disease. So this is a very, very powerful validation of that knowledge. Why Vata located in the lower, in the colon, why would that be so critical to health? And now we understand why it is. So it's really a new age of understanding, and I think it's going to change the way people appreciate Ayurveda and give us a much more profound understanding of why food is so important and this beautiful relationship between the brain and the gut itself. Thank you very much.
Jai Gurudev.
Heaven is descending, descending on the earth. Heaven is descending, descending on the earth. Heaven on earth, heaven on earth, heaven on earth. Heaven is descending, descending on the earth. Light of God is bringing heaven on earth. Gurudev's grace is bringing heaven on earth. Heaven on earth, heaven on earth, heaven on earth. Light of God is bringing heaven on earth. heaven on earth, heaven on earth. Heaven is descending, descending on the earth. Heaven is descending, descending on the earth. Who does graces bring?